So let's pick up with the international motor vehicle manufacturer Ford being fined 35 million rand for its defective Kuga model. The National Consumer Commission found Ford guilty of contravening the Consumer Protection Act by selling unsafe cars. The Commission received numerous complaints from 2015 relating to the Ford Kuga EcoSport engine spontaneously catching fire. We're now joined by Thezi Mabuza, Acting Commissioner of the National Consumer Commission. She's with us from our studios in Pretoria. Thank you, Ms. Mabuza. So take us back, because Ford at the time, so this was a couple of years ago, did do a recall. I remember it telling consumers they could go in and those engines could be fixed and they could then drive their vehicle out. I challenged Ford at the time if that was adequate given people's fears, but presumably that wasn't good enough for consumers. Tell us what happened after that.
The vehicles continued to burn, some of them even after the second recall. And we tried as much as possible to ensure that consumers get the recalls that they needed. We had engaged Ford on that. There was a lot of development in looking at the specifications to try and make sure that they really do understand what was causing the fires, until at a particular point wherein they realized that the manifold itself was too hot, and then when that manifold was too hot, those cracks started to develop, and then the oil would actually get into the engine, and then the fires will start.
Yeah. Explain that, because you said something interesting, that even after the second recall, there were spontaneous fires. So Ford was still selling unsafe vehicles. Was it aware that it was doing that? Because that's serious.
We would say that it was not really intentional from our investigation when we picked that up. Is that in the recall itself, is that most consumers were called in to make sure that they check their vehicles. But then the issue was that in the design itself, there was nothing to warn the consumers that the coolant was too low. So the level of the coolant and the heat itself contributed to that. But then after the third recall, the change in the specifications allowed for the detection in the level of the coolant and the heating system itself, so that consumers would be warned to say that if that heat is too much and the coolant is too low, then the vehicle would not be driven.
Yeah, so you mean after the first and second recall, maybe Ford Kuga owners had their cars fixed, but they weren't really fixed?
We would say they were really fixed, because looking at the incidences then from the time when the both recalls, the second and the third recalls came in, is that the incidences themselves were minimized to a level that is really acceptable.
Okay, so this isn't about how Ford handled the situation, how it handled those recalls. It didn't give owners new cars, it just said they could get fixed. But this is about the cars being sold in the first place, is that correct, wittingly or unwittingly?
Yes, for us as the Commission, it's actually the conduct of Ford in the manner in which they actually impacted the South African market, because their violation in violating the act is that impact had actually a negative consequence to the South African in general, because it was not only the consumers that were affected, it was also the public in general. Because when you were driving behind a Ford Kuga, one of the consumers would even, one of the drivers would stand aside to allow the Ford Kuga to pass by, but also as well the cost that South Africa had to bear when actually they had to retrieve the wreckages and the damage it made on the road. So for us as the Commission, the real action was that conduct that they engaged in providing unsafe vehicles.
But is 35 million rand enough for a huge global motor company selling potentially deadly cars?
As a Commission, we feel that 35 million was enough, because we did not only consider that lump sum that's going to the fiscus, we considered a number of other factors before. What we can say to you is that when we did both recalls, what came on into the fore is that all those recalls had an impact on Ford's profit, because the recall themselves, from the maintenance part, the first and the second, in total, they actually cost around 336 million. But then over and above that, they had to now reimburse consumers for the vehicles that had burned. And then when we considered the fine itself, we did not consider the entire pocket or maybe the entire income of Ford globally, but we were looking at the market, at the South African market, how much they were making. But as you can see, when we determine the fine, we are looking at the profit that they made in selling those vehicles. Cars that were sold in South Africa, the Ford Kuga EcoSport, it was around 4,300 and odd, around there. So it was not really much compared to the global market.
Yeah. And presumably because of the amount of the fine, you don't believe that Ford was being malicious, selling unsafe vehicles knowingly. Presumably you think that this was a mistake on their part. Am I correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, you are correct. You are correct. From the side or from our investigation is that when we looked at the impact in South Africa, or the mishap that happened and the cause of the fire, we compared that to what had happened in the US. We also compared that to what had happened in Australia. We found that all those three cases were not related. So in any other way, from our investigation when we started, we thought that actually there was a relationship between the three incidences, but from what we picked up from our investigation and the information that was provided to us in relation to the design and the research before the Ford Kuga was brought into South Africa, we realized that those three incidences were not related. So the incident in South Africa was totally different from what had happened in Australia. So we know that it was not intentional.
And thank you for bringing that up. So let's just clarify for viewers that there were claims at the time that Ford knew about the problem because there had been recalls in other countries around this particular model, but you're saying that that's not the case. The issues were very different.
Yes, I'll confirm that the issues were very different.
Now, Rochelle Jimmy, that dispute is the subject of another inquiry. Can you just confirm that that's not part of this agreement? You weren't looking at that car that caught fire. Rochelle Jimmy died, but Ford has always maintained it wasn't because of the same issue, the engine fire.
Ma'am, can I just bring you into confidence as South Africans, is that when the complaints were filed, yes, in the Jimmy Mehta story, it was also a Ford Kuga. But then in this instance, yes, the complaint was filed with us. And in August this year, we received, can I say, an instruction from the attorneys saying that they are withdrawing their matter, because I think based on what was discussed and all that, they believe that it was not related, or there was not reasonable, any information reasonable enough to say that he perished because of that incident. So it was unconclusive. And again in November, end of October, we received a letter again from the attorneys requesting the commissioner in reminding us that they withdrew their matter, so they don't want that matter to be part of our discussions moving forward.
So that will be part of the second, a very different inquest, and we're going to look at that a bit later in the show. Did it help Ford that it came and negotiated with you? Let's just be clear, this was a negotiated settlement, and also that beyond Rochelle Jimmy, nobody died.
Can you repeat the question again? I didn't hear that.
I'm saying, did it help Ford in terms of the final payout that they came to you and asked to negotiate, that this was a negotiated settlement? And also there's the fact that people survived. It was only Rochelle Jimmy where there was a fatality.
For us, this was a negotiated settlement. both parties agreed in terms of the terms thereof. And the issue that we know is that the issue of Jimmy and all that was not really part of the settlement itself.
Quick final question. So 50,000 Rand, there are three options being given to Ford Kuga owners. 50,000 Rand, or they may apply for more if their car was damaged. I'm surprised by that because hasn't Ford already sort of compensated for that if vehicles were completely damaged? And then there's a third option. Does that mean they can go to court? They can really pursue this in court in future if they want to?
Yes. In the third option allows consumers to actually approach the court. I would say that from Section 60 of the CPA is that when a supplier is liable, the first option from the Commission is that we were supposed just to apply for a certificate to allow consumers to approach the court and then apply for damages there. But looking at the impact and the number of consumers and the cost actually of going to a court of law and the time that it will take for consumers to get a recourse, we then opted for the first option and then as well as the second option. The third option would be the last that the Act provided for. So in that negotiated settlement is that we tried to look at the South African circumstance and look at our consumers, and then we also wanted not to burden them any further from what they had endured in suffering from actually losing their vehicles and some of them their possessions as well.
All right, sure. So if you were driving a Ford Kuga, if it caught fire or not, 50,000 Rand is owed to you by Ford, but there is that option for more legal recourse if you want to pursue it. Thezi Mabuza, Acting Commissioner of the National Consumer Commission.